Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started, folks, but just before we introduce our speakers for today, I just want to go through a couple of quick administrative announcements, typical ones. This particular session does qualify for continuing education credits for medical professionals, allied mental health professionals, alcohol and drug counselors, and social workers. So to receive CME credit, you would log into the Dartmouth Hitchcock Center for Learning and Professional Development. You can either text the code for today, which is 9BET, to the number on your screen, 3464334. I have a printout of it for those of you here in the room, and if you need me to repeat this at any time, for those of you online, please let me know. And then likewise for the CEU credits, if you would wish to earn credits for attending this session, please just email one of us, myself, Bethany, or Olivia or Andrea, if you know any of us, and we can get you a certificate for attending today's event. As always, there's no conflicts of interest to disclose, either in the planning of the science series as a whole or in today's speaker, but I think the speakers will actually go through that as well. And then just a quick plug, our next science series presentation is going to be January 24th. Which is also a Thursday right after the new year, where we're going to talk to Lisa Paterno from Maine Quality Counts and Jean Ryer here from the New Hampshire Citizens Health Initiative, and talk about some of the work that they've been doing in New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine, actually, utilizing an ECHO model for treatments and assistance to providers for treatment in medication-assisted therapy. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who's going to introduce our speakers, and we're going to get started.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our science series of the Northeast node of the National Drug Abuse Treatment Clinical Trials Network. It's great to see you all here, and thanks for folks joining remotely. We have a terrific topic today on parental substance misuse and child trauma, and two exceptional researchers doing really pioneering work in this space. So one of our speakers is Dr. Kay Jankowski, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry here at Dartmouth and also associate director of the Dartmouth Trauma Interventions Research Center at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center. And Dr. Jankowski has published and presented extensively in child and adolescent trauma. She has been leading a project for the New Hampshire Partners for Change project, which is focused on social and emotional well-being of children and youth in child welfare and juvenile justice systems. And she's the co-principal investigator for the New Hampshire Adoption Preparation and Preservation Project, which has a goal of promoting successful adoption by creating a trauma-informed, evidence-based, and adoption-competent child welfare system. She is a certified trainer for trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy and an experienced clinical psychologist. She has a practice here at Dartmouth Hitchcock. And our co-presenter today is Dr. Erin Knight, who's a research associate at the Center for Program Design and Evaluation at Dartmouth. And previously, she conducted research on education of students with developmental delays and the effectiveness of academic, social, emotional, and behavioral school-based intervention systems. And there at that center, she was involved with multiple project teams, including those at Dartmouth Trauma Interventions Research Center, conducting both qualitative and quantitative work. So we're really pleased to have you here. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Great, thank you, Lisa, for that nice introduction. Okay, and I just want to say that we're really excited to be able to be here. This is a topic that my colleagues, not just Erin, but other colleagues as well here at Dartmouth, that we have really been kind of thinking a lot about and researching for quite a while. And so it's nice to be able to share what we've been doing and some of our thoughts with all of you, and also to hear your ideas. Just so to start out, just to give you kind of a sense of the scope of the problem, in terms of the nationally representative or national statistics on children affected by a parent or a caregiver with a substance use disorder, and this is data that's accumulated from 2009 to 2014 with parents, and the criteria is kids living with at least one parent with a past year substance use disorder. We find that about 12.5% of kids are reporting being in this situation, okay? And I think given that that data is from 2009 to 2014, we may expect that that's even higher at this point. Granted, the majority of those kids are living with a parent or caregiver with an alcohol use disorder, but we also see other drug abuse as well. And just to give you some other information, and this is specific to New Hampshire, but this is kind of another way of slicing the pie, another way of looking at the scope of the problem. This is showing over the decade from 2006 to 2016, where we see a real increase in babies born with neonatal abstinence syndrome, which I know a number of you are already familiar with. This is some data from New Hampshire Division for Children, Youth, and Families, and this is from Kristen Smith's car seat report. She's done a lot of really nice work looking at trying to get a handle on the demographics and prevalence rates of kids living with a caregiver with substance use disorder. This is accepted assessments, so these are not necessarily found in cases. So this is assessments. But we can see the increase from 2013 to 2016, and that we see that there is an increase from about 40% to 51% in assessments with substance abuse risk factors, and then a sort of a more serious level gets to the assessments with the substance abuse allegation, and we see some increase there as well. I think where we really see the jump, and this was quite illuminating and kind of startling for me, is when we look at the number of kids that are actually removed from their home. Okay, so you have to look at child welfare data. There are a number of different ways of looking at it. So there's assessments, and then there's number of kids in care, and then there's the number of kids that are actually removed from the home. And I think this is really where we see the difference here. And I'm going to show you this line. So we see there's been a 53% increase from 2012 to 2016 of kids being removed from their homes. And I think the other interesting thing about this is that you see that the greatest increase here is in young children. Okay, so the different colors represent age groups. So we see 0 to 2 and the 3 to 5 age ranges is where we're seeing the greatest increase of numbers of kids going into care or getting taken out of their homes. So in 2012, we had 30% of youth being removed from care had a substance abuse allegation. And in 2016, we see that 60% of those kids removed, there's a substance abuse allegation. So today, I'm going to cover a little bit about childhood trauma and ACEs, because I think it's hard to talk about this topic without talking about trauma. But then we're also going to present, Erin and I in particular have really been diving into the literature on looking specifically at the effects of parental substance abuse on child outcomes and trying to understand those mechanisms a little bit. And then we're going to get into a little bit of our work, where we've done some key informant interviews, and we've looked at some of our data in relation to administrative data from DCYF around substance abuse allegations. And then we'll also talk some about what we can do about this problem, because I think that's also really important. So how do we think about getting a handle on mitigating the effects of parental substance abuse on these children? Okay. So I just want to start with this this quotation, because I think it's a really important way to kind of frame this issue and to really just hone in right from the outset about what we're talking about in terms of how the potential for parental trauma or parental substance use to impact children. Okay, that basically, so scientists have discovered that the experiences children have early in life and the environments in which they have them not only shape their brain architecture, but also affect whether, how, and when the developmental instructions carried in their genes are expressed. So this is how the environment of relationships young children experience with adult caregivers, as well as other things, get under the skin and influence lifelong learning behavior in both physical and mental health, for better or for worse. Okay, so this is really what we're talking about here, is really the effect of caregivers and the health of caregivers to be able to provide all that nurturance and all that support to children, which we know that children need to develop, you know, in healthy ways. So I don't have a lot of time. We want to cover a lot in this topic, in this presentation. So I'm just going to kind of quickly go through these trauma slides, or at least I'm going to try to. My area is trauma, so it's hard, even more so than substance abuse, so it's a little tricky. But just there are a number of different ways to think about stress and to think about trauma. So I just want to present one is kind of stress in and of itself is not bad. Okay, in fact, from a child development perspective, we want kids to be able to experience stress. We want children to be frustrated in certain ways. That's what develops, that's what allows them to develop some resilience and some ability to deal with adversity. Okay, so, but you know, stress exists on a continuum. So this kind of, I think, is a nice graphic to kind of describe, you know, that there can be things such as positive stress, which I think of as kind of everyday stressors. And particularly for kids who have good, healthy relationships, you know, these are experiences that are helping them strengthen their development. And in the middle here, we have what we might describe as tolerable events. So, you know, a child dealing with the loss of a loved one, perhaps, or a car accident, or a medical illness. And again, especially if we have supportive caregiving, most of these children can do pretty well, and can maybe perhaps with some treatment, perhaps with natural support, can recover and really do just fine. Where we really get into where we really kind of get worried and get concerned is when we get into the area of what we might call toxic stress or chronic stress, which is really what we think of as our abuse, witnessing domestic violence, our major traumas, and particularly when we have cumulative traumas, so a number of traumas that go on for a prolonged period of time, particularly when they go on, like they're perpetrated by caregivers or happen in the home, let's say. And then again, particularly if there is no protective relationship, that's really when we get into that area of kind of impairments in neurodevelopment and kind of a lot of negative outcomes, which we will get to in this talk. We also, when we think about trauma, I just want you all to also think about trauma is also defined in the DSM-5. And in this situation, we're thinking about actual or threatened death, serious injury, or threat to bodily integrity. So we think of direct traumas, again, so this is physical, sexual abuse, for example. Those are some of the most common ones, or that we see a lot with children, particularly around child welfare systems. It can also be witnessing, so classic witnessing domestic violence, but it can also be like witnessing community violence. So kids, not as common up here, but certainly in more urban areas, you know, we see kids who witness drive-by shootings or witnessing, and we can see kids, you know, witnessing any kind of violence in the home or out on the street. Learning about a traumatic event for a caregiver. Okay, so this is also particularly for children. There are some categories of trauma that are more common in children. And then also just from a SAM, there are lots of definitions of trauma or ways to think about trauma. This is kind of another way to think about it, the 3 E's. So it's the event, the experience or the appraisal of that event, what people do with that event, how they make meaning of that event, and then the effect, what they're left with. So trauma sometimes is conceptualized as kind of that whole package. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because we've already covered some of these, but acute, so these are kind of different categories of trauma. We've got our acute trauma, car accidents, etc. We've got our chronic trauma or our toxic stress. Just want to mention complex trauma as well. Some of you may hear this as kind of a buzzword in our field a lot, where complex trauma is kind of the effects of chronic trauma. So we've got, you know, perpetration by a caregiver, we've got cumulative trauma, and what it really means is that we see a whole range of effects. So it doesn't just lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, it's going to lead to a huge number of disruptions, kind of across multiple domains of child health and development. And then on the far right here, we have neglect. Okay, and this is important, particularly around caregivers, experiencing caregiver substance abuse, because I think a lot of that is more common with neglect. And that is when we really see a failure to provide for a child's basic needs. There can also be emotional neglect. Okay, so it can be more of the physical needs, but it can also be real profound, absence of being able to meet children's emotional needs as well. And this is particularly an issue for young children, okay, because we know that those things are so critical for young. They're important for children of all ages, but particularly for young children. Okay, so adverse childhood experiences. I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with the major public health study of the adverse childhood events, and I don't have a lot of time to get into it, but I just want to kind of hit the highlights here, because parental substance abuse is one of the 10 adverse childhood events. So this is a study that was conducted in the 90s, large HMO, fairly middle-class sample of adults who were reporting retrospectively on their childhood experiences, okay, and childhood experiences of adversity. And I'll show you, I have a slide that shows the different specific ACEs. But they correlated, they looked at the association of these early childhood experiences with people's health and well-being and behaviors, and they also correlated it with physical health status. So lots of findings that have come from this study, lots of additional research that's come. But I guess the two major points that I want to make here is, one is that ACEs are extremely, basically the researchers were kind of overwhelmed with how many people, how common these are. So almost 2/3 of participants, and again, this is a pretty middle-class adult population. We're reporting about 2/3 were reporting at least one ACE, and then of that 2/3, about 1/3 were reporting 3 or more ACEs. So that's point number one. Point number two is that the way ACEs are often presented, that when we talk about the ACEs, we talk about the cumulative effect of ACEs. So it's kind of the number of ACEs that one has, and I think, from my perspective, I think one of the most important, and I think why the ACEs has had so much impact, is that it's been so consistent in the findings of the cumulative effect of ACEs on so many different domains of adult functioning. Okay, so we see it not just with mental health, not just with depression, anxiety, trauma-related symptoms, but we see it with physical health, and we see it with a lot of health risk behaviors. Okay, and like across the board, almost uniformly, we see a graded relationship. So this is a slide that shows the different kinds of ACEs. So we've got emotional, physical, and sexual abuse on the abuse side. I'm going to see if I can get all this right, but domestic violence, and then substance abuse, et cetera. There's a number of them. But what I think is striking here is that substance abuse is the second most common adverse childhood experience, which I actually wasn't aware of until pretty recently. So that retrospectively, 27% of these adults are reporting that they lived with a parent with a substance abuse disorder. Okay, so even more than, so separation, the two rings with the line is separation and divorce. So that more adults are reporting living with a parent with substance use than separation and divorce. Okay, and I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this pyramid. Again, I don't want to get into all the, I don't want to get into it too much, but this is kind of the pathway from how ACEs ultimately lead to increased morbidity and mortality. And I have this in here because I think, to me, this speaks to the importance. We know that parental substance abuse is a really common ACE, among others. That, you know, how do we look at how we mitigate these effects? How do we do early intervention for prevention to be able to, you know, address some of the problems so that these kids don't end up at the top of this pyramid? All right. Okay, so I mentioned in the beginning that one of the things that we have been doing is we conducted some key informant interviews. So let me back up for a minute. So my colleagues and I, we have been working with the New Hampshire DCYF for 5+ years, trying to install and evaluate practices that we've implemented within their system to improve children's well-being and trauma-related symptoms. Okay, one of which is screening. So we now have implemented in DCYF. They're supposed to be doing screening for all adjudicated kids for mental health and trauma-related symptoms. And so one of the things that we found over the course of our work, as I'm sure will not be a surprise to any of you working around the opioid crisis, is just how taxed the system has been. Not just child welfare, but the mental health system and kind of all the systems that interface with child welfare by the opioid crisis. And you've already seen that, like, in terms of a workforce issue, there's so many more kids that are coming into care, right? So the workforce has just been overwhelmed. And then it affects the foster care system. So we don't have enough foster families to place these kids in, okay? Or kinship, relatives. All of a sudden we've got grandparents, we've got, you know, all these relatives that are being asked to take care of these kids, and they're just, like, the whole system has just felt extremely stressed out. So I think this is what led us to really want to do some more in-depth work. And I think the other piece to that is that we felt like, and we were sort of watching this whole thing happen, and our experience has been that the child serving system has just been woefully unprepared to and not funded well enough to be able to address, you know, just the overwhelming needs of these kids and families. So just as a kind of a preface to why we decided to kind of do some of these interviews, and because there was so little out there around in the literature and kind of in the state at the time when we started this, we just decided to kind of go across sectors. I was really interested in kind of taking a 360-degree, you know, view of this. What are the kind of the attitudes, and what, if you look at, you know, mental health, law enforcement, child welfare, education, how are they thinking about these kids? Pediatrics, we interviewed Steve as well. You know, how are these different service sectors thinking about these kids? How do they identify these kids? What kinds of services are available? You know, where are they at in this process? So we've included in our presentation a number of quotations from these interviews. And I think this one, to me, kind of captures, I think, two things. One is the provider's kind of dis-ease about, okay, what do I even do with these kids and families? And then it's sort of so kind of it's not targeted. It's like, okay, this child has been sexually abused, we can refer them to this particular treatment, let's say. It's diffuse, right? It's hard to really get a handle on exactly, you know, what all the effects are, and this issue about chaos. So that comes up a lot. So the other thing that we've been trying to do is to kind of play around a little bit with different models and different ways of thinking. Again, I'm really interested in this idea of, you know, parental substance use, we know, is one of the adverse childhood events, okay? And adverse childhood events do not happen in a vacuum, okay? They tend to hang together. So there's a lot of contextual people who are, as you all know, people who are abusing substances, they're likely to have other stressors. There's more domestic violence. There's more, risk for abuse. There's a lot of different issues as well. And yet we also know that parental substance abuse is really critical for leading to negative child outcomes. And so how do we understand that? So we've just presented this as kind of this is a work in progress. This is kind of our thinking right now and trying to take something that I think is quite complex into something that we can begin to get our heads around and understand. So the way I look at this is kind of the top box here, impacts on parents' behavior, is how do we understand the direct effects of how, use of substances in parents, how does that impair parenting? Okay, how does that impair parenting, and then how does that lead to negative child outcomes? And the box below here is kind of all the contextual factors. Again, like that it doesn't happen alone. So, how does all these other pieces, how do they fit into the picture here? Because they are important, particularly as we're thinking about interventions and what to do about this problem. But it's also trying to tease apart some of these issues. So in terms of, thinking a little bit about, so how does parental substance use affect parenting? Okay, so we know, that there are certain things about effective parenting that do make a difference for kids. Okay, which and I'm not going to get into all the specifics about parenting, but basically we're looking for things like safety, ability to keep children safe, ability to be reliable, to provide reliable, consistent, kind of nurturing parenting. So, this is not an exhaustive list at all, but these are the kinds of things that we have been thinking about, and also that come up in the literature a lot, that can have a direct effect on child outcomes. So certainly, the issues around the parent's ability to meet children's needs. Okay, so if you've got a parent who is abusing substances, that's going to interfere in their ability to be, in general, it could interfere in their ability to be emotionally available to those children. So the emotional unavailability of the parent. One thing that we know about child development and emotional development is that children need to feel that they're prioritized. Children need to feel important. They need to feel that they are, number one to their parents. So if you've got a parent that is abusing, this is a problem, right? Because what we know about drug-seeking behaviors is that it doesn't leave a lot of room for being able to have other priorities. Okay, so that I think that is a very important one. Obviously, we have lack of supervision. Again, parents may be putting a lot of time into seeking drugs and drug activity, and so these kids are left alone, let's say, for long periods of time, not given adequate supervision. Decreased provision for child's basic needs, and again, this is the neglect piece. So if that parent is not prioritizing this child's needs, then they may not even meet their basic physical needs as well. The likelihood of separation, family inconsistency, I think this is important. I think across the literature, we know that separation from attachment figures, separation from caregivers, it can be very difficult for children. That is consistently related to negative outcomes for children. And again, if you think about parental substance abuse, even for sort of the best intentioned parents who are trying to go to recovery, there are a lot of periods, or there can be a lot of periods of separation. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that that these kids are never going to be able to recover, but we just have to be kind of eyes wide open about what some of these risks really are. Maintaining family secrets. So the shame and the stigma and the secrecy that goes along with substance abuse, I think is a key here as well, and particularly where there's a threat of child protection involvement as well. Because oftentimes these kids really, they don't want to talk. They don't want to reveal what might be going on in the home. And so those kids are burdened with these big secrets, okay? And we know that has deleterious effects as well. Child fearing an overdose or child worrying about where the parent is, let's say, okay? That's, you know, that's going to take up a lot of brain space for that child who otherwise we want exploring their environments and hanging out with their friends and like not having to worry about that. Okay. The other thing, coercive parenting. So there's literature that shows that parents who have a substance use disorder have more difficulty with emotion regulation. Okay, so they're not as able to regulate their emotions, which can affect parenting. So they're more likely, perhaps, to get overly aggressive with their children or to use more harsher discipline, right? So then we've got a problem where, you know, that's another pathway in which the substance abuse can affect the parenting. And what happens with coercive parenting is that kids then end up acting out more. So then we've got more child behavior problems, which then become more difficult for the parent to handle. And if we've got impairments in emotion regulation, then, you know, then we've got just, it becomes much more challenging for that parent to be able to parent effectively. So I've alluded a lot to kind of what are the negative effects on children. And here's a slide that just kind of pictorially, you know, describes. Unfortunately, the literature is pretty clear that there's a whole range of negative, potentially negative outcomes. So we've got, you know, poor social skills, we've got physical health problems. Again, you know, a lot of what you see with the ACEs is also true, not just in adulthood, but also in childhood. And we see a lot of this with parental substance abuse. And we've got the what we call externalizing behaviors, which are disruptive behavior disorders. Those are the kids that are kind of behaviorally out of control. They're aggressive. They're going to have attention, impulse control kinds of issues. And then we've got the internalizing problems, the depression, the anxiety, more PTSD kinds of problems. I think something that's been well established in the literature is the increased risk for drug and alcohol use, particularly in adolescence. We know that having a parent that's a substance use disorder is a major risk factor for that as well. And then we've got school issues, okay? A lot of impairment in performance at school as well. And just before I turn it over to Erin, I just want to say that you know, we're talking about generalities here, so it doesn't mean that, you know, every parent with a substance use disorder is going to have all of these impairments in parenting and their children are going to have all these negative outcomes. I mean, I think, you know, clearly there are issues around the severity of the substance use, the degree to which there are other caring adults in the picture, other protective factors. Okay, so I just want to put that out there, that it doesn't mean that this is true for everybody.
So I get to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing along with some other colleagues related to exploring these issues in the state of New Hampshire a little bit more. But before I dig deeper into that, I also wanted to talk about how Kay has mentioned and has been talking about different impacts that parental substance misuse can have on parenting, contextual factors, and child outcomes. And a lot of this research has been conducted in families that are involved in the child welfare system. So the Division of Children, Youth, and Families, right? And these happen to be kids who are in families who are potentially most highly impacted, right? They're more likely to experience abuse and neglect. They're more likely to have a higher number of traumas. So this is a highly impacted group. And then even just looking at involvement with DCYF or child welfare, kids who have a parent who misuses substances are more likely to be referred to Child Protective Services. Once they've been referred, they're more likely to have a substantiated case, so meaning that there's a positive finding of abuse or neglect. And then parents who misuse substances are also more likely to lose custody of their children. are less likely to comply with court orders and are thus more likely to permanently lose custody. So there's a lot of issues specifically with regard to this problem of parental substance misuse even within the child welfare population. So Kay has talked a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in the state of New Hampshire to really dig deeper into this problem of parental substance misuse, especially in response to the opioid crisis. And in addition to looking at what's going on once kids get into DCYF, we wanted to take a step back and look at what's happening higher up on the continuum. So not just within DCYF, but within law enforcement and their interactions with children who are affected by parental substance misuse, or folks in mental health, or folks in healthcare, and even schools, people who are interacting with children on a daily basis. We've kind of hinted at a lot of the times parental substance misuse might not get identified until it's kind of reached a point of chaos. So looking further up the line, what does it look like when kids are in schools and interacting with people on a daily basis, or community-based resources? So we've got a number of different data collection methods going on with this work, and I'll just provide a brief snapshot of that. There's a lot of information currently being collected as well, and we're excited to dig deeper into that. So I'll just provide a quick little snapshot here today. But Kate mentioned the Partners for Change project, where trauma screenings are being conducted. So looking at symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, number of trauma exposures, and just general child well-being, and these screenings being conducted in DCYF. So we've actually been able to take a list of kids who've received a screening over the past few years and have asked DCYF to match that data to data from their assessments. So that data includes information on whether it was a case of abuse or neglect. It includes information on different permanency indicators. So for instance, the number of removals from the home they've had, the duration and their current placement. But perhaps most importantly, it also includes information on parental substance misuse that was noted at the time of assessment in DCYF. So Kate talked a little bit about allegations and risk factors and what that looks like. So they've managed to match some of that data to the data that we have on screening. So that's one set of data collection that we have and are able to look at. We also just wanted to dig deeper into this issue. So we conducted are in the middle of conducting a two-phase mixed methods evaluation using an exploratory sequential design. So what that looks like is we've conducted a number of, 13 interviews with 15 individuals to explore this issue, and have looked at a number of different domains, and then use those results to narrow down the focus for distribution of a survey more widely. And some of those domains include impacts to the child. So what are different impacts to the child? Identification practices, I believe Dave mentioned this, services available, biggest priorities and challenges moving forward. And then we're also interested in looking at cross-system collaboration. And in addition to this idea that identification is a really tough thing to do because it's such a multifaceted problem, and it's difficult to identify what kids have been affected by parental substance misuse since it can look so different for different children and different families, is this idea that it is truly a really multifaceted problem that can have impacts on really different areas. So we explored that a little bit more, and I'll just provide some brief snapshots of data from both those screening results and then also a little bit from the interviews in relation to how parental substance misuse occurs within the context of different adversities as well. So this is just, again, a really quick snapshot of some of the data that we're able to look at using some of the information DCYF has provided us. So we're able to kind of look at the proportions of children who are affected by parental substance misuse versus those who are not affected by parental substance misuse as per information from DCYF. We've been looking at this based on ages, so the age of the child, and if it's more prevalent in younger or older children. And we've also been able to look at this a little bit with regard to is abuse, what does it look like for abuse versus neglect? And there's a number of ways to interpret some of this information, but you can highlight the impact of neglectful parenting on children with parental substance misuse. But you can also note that, as I mentioned earlier, cases that involve parental substance misuse might often be more capable of being substantiated. So it's also possible that, particularly for neglect cases, it might be easier to come to a positive finding if parental substance misuse quickly into some of those different contextual factors that came up in some of our interviews. So as I mentioned, there's this issue with identification, but also this multifaceted nature of the problem. So just a couple things that came up with regard to contextual adversities in parental substance misuse. So exposure to dangerous materials, so drugs and other drug-related content, even increased foot traffic in the home, inconsistency in family transitions. So the caregiver being out of the home, maybe in treatment or in jail, even just really disruptive caregiving, so moving placements, that kind of thing. Kay mentioned the experience of having a parent overdose, or even the fear of having a parent overdose can lead to an increased sense of responsibility for the child or heightened anxiety. And then even just that having a parent in jail and the specific impact of that on the child as well. So as you can kind of see, we've really highlighted this idea that there's, again, as Kay mentioned, there's different risk factors and protective factors that are occurring with a child with parental substance misuse. But if you look at the collage of all of these risk factors and contextual adversities, and you consider them all together, they can really have a increasingly deleterious effect on the child, depending on how many risk factors there are, right? So parental substance misuse can occur with, can co-occur often with poverty, with issues with housing, issues with employment, decreased social support systems. And you can really see that having more of these risk factors can have a potentially negative effect on the child. So all of this being said, we just want to talk about treatment models that are available. This is, again, going to be a snapshot. So it's a multifaceted problem, which means that there's a lot of different ways that you can look at the treatment models, but we're going to talk about a few evidence-based treatment models to address specific features.
Okay. Yeah. So as Erin was saying, you know, so for me, you know, as a trauma person, even with cumulative trauma, like, okay, abuse, neglect, or particularly forms of abuse, like it's easier to get my hands around that, my head around kind of, okay, what do I do for somebody who's been sexually abused? I think one of the tricky things with parental substance abuse is that it really is so diffuse. And so, you know, we're never going to have one particular treatment model that is going to work for all kids, or even all kids of one particular age range that is going to treat the effects of parental substance abuse. Okay, so that I think is the overarching message here, and it's not going to lead to a particular disorder. So, you know, I think we really need to kind of look at what are our goals, like what are the goals of treatment, what are we, or intervention, you know, what do we actually want to try to do? And I think first and foremost, we want to treat the parental substance use, right? Because we want, I mean, assuming that caregiver, that parent or caregiver is alive, has not overdosed or, you know, died, that we want to try to get those children back with that parent, you know, and I mean, when possible, okay, there are situations where that's not possible, but we want to try to, you know, treat the substance use and be able to get that parent back and able to meet the needs of that child. Particularly when I think about, there's a huge sort of crisis in child welfare net right now because there aren't enough care providers. We don't have enough foster homes, and we don't have enough relative providers to take care of these kids. So we really actually don't have a choice. I mean, we need to work with families, and I believe in that as well, but I think also just from a public health perspective. So we need to treat the parental substance use disorder. I think that, and we're going to get to this, I think that a real key piece here is that we need parenting modules, parenting adjunct parenting, or, you know, parenting treatments that go with the substance use treatment, because we know that we need to reestablish the role of the parent as the safe, effective provider, okay, or protector, and we need to sensitize the parent to the needs of their children, because they've been shifted away from that. And we really need to help them understand how do we parent, what are the needs of the kids, and how do we get back to that. And this is really coming out of, especially the number 2 thing here, reestablishing the role of the parent as the safe, effective protector. That we see this in trauma models, particularly trauma models for domestic violence. That a lot of kids that grow up in homes with domestic violence, particularly if it's violence against their mom, let's say, and they're living with the mom, they no longer see that mother as being able to keep them safe and trustworthy, okay? And I'm not blaming the victim here, I'm not saying that it's the mom's fault, but the power dynamics get disrupted. And I think that we have a similar issue going on in a lot of these homes with substance use. These kids are not able to trust that their parents are able to be safe and reliable caregivers. So that needs to be a major emphasis. There are situations where we also need to treat the mental health issues and the trauma-related symptoms in the child. Okay, if we've got kids that are really symptomatic, we need to be addressing those needs. And a lot of the trauma models have good parenting pieces to them. So that, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. I mean, we know how to talk to parents about trauma and the effects of trauma on kids that can actually help really shore up their parenting abilities and be able to meet the needs of their traumatized kids. Ideally, treatment would be comprehensive, multi-pronged, family-focused, with potential for individual work with the child if appropriate. And the importance of other supports, not just mental health treatment. So I say this all the time to people, that particularly when we think about resilience and protective factors, like treatment is just one piece of what children and families need. And that, this is where faith-based community work and schools and family resource centers and, all the natural supports become really important here as well. But just to talk a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about child-parent psycho, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to just mention briefly child-parent psychotherapy, which is really the treatment that has the most evidence behind it for young children. It is a trauma model. It's coming out of the domestic violence arena, but it also, I think, has a huge amount of relevance for this population. And then for our older kids, trauma-focused CBT, again, it is an individual model, but there's also people doing trauma-focused CBT work the right way. You do a lot of parenting work as well, and there's a lot of potential there. And then Erin's done a really nice review of the parenting literature. So we also have some information about parenting models as well. So real briefly, child-parent psychotherapy, or CPT, as we often call it, is specifically for young children, and it is a dyadic model. So it's with the child and the caregiver. Doesn't have to be the birth parent, but the focus is really on attachment. It's on helping the therapist is really working with that dyad, with the relationship that becomes the client, and it's really trying to help that parent be able to help the child regulate their emotions, process their trauma, reestablish that safety, reestablish themselves as a trustworthy figure. Okay, it's been mostly tested. I don't think there are any RCTs at this point looking at it specifically with substance abusing parents. Most of the work has been done, as I said, with domestic violence and mothers with depression. But we do see reductions in PTSD symptoms, improvements in behavior problems with the kids, enhanced attachment security, decreased PTSD in carriers. The nice thing about CPT, actually, and CBT, is that we see good outcomes in both the child and the parent. The biggest problem with CPT is that it has a long duration. Okay, it can really require up to a year of treatment. It's an individual-based model. We've done a lot of training, and one of our colleagues who used to work with us is now working on her own, but we've done a lot of training throughout New Hampshire in CPT, but this is a barrier for a lot of people in a lot of agencies, and the training it requires at least master's level clinicians and to deliver it, and it's a pretty rigorous training model. Trauma-focused CBT for a little bit older kids. This is a time limited. It's a shorter treatment model. There's some attachment, but it's more skills based. It is more CBT involving education about trauma, anxiety management, cognitive coping, and then there is the development of a trauma narrative and a processing of that trauma narrative. And the parent piece is that you're basically doing kind of the parallel process with the child and the parent. So you're providing education to the child, but you're also providing education to the parent. So you're helping them better understand, you know, what their child has gone through. And I think particularly for substance abusing parents, you know, this can be tailored for, and I work with the developers, and they have been thinking about this and working a little bit on this. Okay.
Okay, so we'll just take the last few minutes to quickly jump into some of the work on parenting models, integrated treatment models, and collaborative treatments. So in preparing for the interviews and looking at really what we wanted to look at with that, we did do a literature review that dove into some of the research out there on how to address parental substance misuse, both for the parent, the child, and the family as a whole. And there's some research on parenting models. A lot of it is within the context of integrated treatment models. So not just providing treatment for the substance abuse, but also parenting or child issues or other related issues. And some of the outcomes include looks at parenting, the parental substance abuse, and child adjustment as well. And there are a number of literature reviews and meta-analyses on this topic. And they examined outcomes in a different kind of way, but Misuse and Prince in 2015 suggested that the integrated treatment model, including parenting, a parenting component and a substance abuse component, improves parenting above and beyond a substance abuse component on its own. So it's this idea that having a direct intervention to address parenting can improve that rather than having one treatment that trickles down to these other areas that parental substance misuse can potentially impact. So some of the different components that are included in some of those interventions might be things to address psychosocial functioning, increasing the social support network, things with employability, other contextual factors, parenting knowledge, so increasing knowledge about child development, and then how to parent, parenting skills, emotion regulation to understand the child and increase positive coping mechanisms. And then there's also some to address preoccupation with drug taking and attachment-based parenting. So I'll just really quickly go over this. This is from Misuse and Prince in 2015. They kind of dove into some of the intervention components that different interventions address. The bolded studies had impacts on both parenting and parental substance abuse. And it's difficult to kind of look across studies because there are so many different ways to address it. There's different ages of the child can be a factor. The location of the treatment can be a factor. The particular substance being used can also have differential impacts on the family. So there's a lot of things to consider with this data. So another thing that came up in the literature is collaborative treatments. And this is actually something that we probed folks in our interviews on specifically. So what does cross-system collaboration look like? Is it possible? What facilitates it? What are some barriers? And looking at the literature, they do highlight some potential barriers, obviously, time, limited resources and funding for collaboration activities, having a different client. So integrating treatment from someone who provides treatment for the parent versus someone who provides treatment for the child. They have different clients there. But then there's some facilitators for cross-system collaboration as well, right? So obviously buy-in would play a huge role, providing cross-system training, so getting everyone into the room together to develop a common language and a common goal. And then also something that's come up is having someone from another field embedded within a field. So behavioral health and family practice, for instance, licensed alcohol and drug counselors and DCYF, that kind of thing.
I'm just trying to be sensitive about time. So I'm just wondering.
Maybe
you want
2 more minutes.
And actually, the remaining slides are just steps moving forward. So kind of a quick summary of kind of what we talked about. So basically, multifaceted problem. There's some work being done to try to give a preventative focus, right? So increasing some of the psychosocial factors and such. And also something that came out of the interviews, and we're conducting surveys at this time, but really looking at that identification piece and how do you identify children and families affected by parental substance misuse to be able to intervene early. So that's kind of what our last.
Yeah, and identification in child are really
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have a few minutes left for questions.
joining remotely, feel free to either type in a question or you hear them as well. They ask a question. Yeah, they unmute. If they unmute, you unmute. Okay. And also folks in the room, feel free to ask questions and comments, right?
I'll jump in. This is, as you know, I'm a fan of this work. You guys are doing a great job, and it's so timely. I was in a meeting this morning around the New Hampshire Plan of Safe Care, which every state is coming up with mandated through CARA and CASA that each state have at discharge for babies who are opiate exposed a plan of safe care connecting to community resources, both for baby and for mom. So the idea is a dyadic approach. And so hearing you talk today about your approach and the importance of early identification, it strikes me that that's an opportunity to engage with these other discussions going on across the state. And I wonder what your thoughts are about the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the interesting thing about working with babies, as you know, is, you know, they're a little bit easier to identify and to get their attention of moms and babies because they're coming for pediatric visits. You know, I think it's a really important time, and they're so young, right? So that there's a lot of opportunity to intervene.
I was thinking even two other dimensions. One is the parenting dimension, so not just the development of the baby, but developing parenting skills.
Absolutely.
And that as a proxy for other older kids that are in the home.
Yeah, I feel like we have to be having some parenting interventions available for this population, and exactly how we do that and which ones we use, I think still need to be determined. But I think, you know, I think the research shows that about 2/3 of adults seeking substance abuse treatment, I think, are parents, something like that. So, you know, it's a huge part of the lives. Now, they may not all be with their children, but we never know if they're going to be reunited or if they're going to have other children. Like, it's a big domain of their lives. And we know that there's so much impact on those parents, on their children, that, you know, I think parenting is incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. And also that connection to the caregiver can be a protective factor against
Yeah,
later
exactly.
developing substance or alcohol use. So again, that idea is a great point for developing protective factors.
And I think that, you know, the point of access of babies and moms, I think, makes a huge amount of sense. Because the older those kids get, the harder it is to really get a handle on the scope of the problem and how to address it.
Thank you for this really important presentation. You talked a lot at the end about your work looking at what's evolving with the opioid crisis. And I wonder what, if anything, you've seen nationally, what momentum have you seen nationally for initiatives specifically targeting this group of kids that are being exposed to, you know, this sort of, you know, parental opioid use phenomena that we're seeing across the nation. Have you seen many initiatives or new funding that's coming specifically targeting kids that are exposed to this? We're very focused on, you know, overdose deaths and expanding treatment, and a lot of other things are really important. But I wonder, what are we doing for the young generation?
So the national statistics are consistent with New Hampshire in terms of there are more and more kids there are more and more assessments, there are more and more kids that are going into care. So we know that. That is clear across the board. I mean, it varies somewhat by state. I think, unfortunately, we're trying to catch up to the problem. You know, I think there hasn't been a lot of emphasis on addressing the needs of the kids. You know, I think it's been very, you guys are familiar with, you know, it's like, okay, we've got to address, you know, putting our fingers in the dikes, and how do we sort of take care of the most pressing problems, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that the children are a little bit more downstream. And they don't have as much of a voice, right? So I think that they are kind of left behind, and we see that across the board with other types of problems as well. So I think that there is a huge need. I think that they're definitely recognizing the need for pregnant pregnant women and babies. So I think that we've made inroads there. But I think even there, like we have, and Steve and I have talked a lot about this, like there hasn't been enough emphasis on the needs of the children. And children are constantly growing, and a lot of these moms who are pregnant have older children. So, it's not just the mom and the baby. Plus, there are potentially fathers or other care providers in the picture. And so, I think that there's a real need for it. There has been, in terms of funding opportunities, there have been some. Like I applied for one SAMHSA grant, which we didn't get, unfortunately. But when I looked at, so they funded 9 sites across the country, and not one was specifically focused on substance use. They were all like related to other at-risk kinds of issues of children, which I thought was interesting. And I don't know enough. Sometimes I think that that has to do with kind of the politics of funding, and that there's certain like substance abuse funding that's earmarked for substance abuse, and I think that the children might be falling through the cracks. So I think it's an issue that needs to be addressed.
So we are out of time, but thank you again for your great presentation.